after that, except that. Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Thorpe, and I want to welcome you to the Medical Center Hour for the 13th of November, 1985. The subject today, the human condition, a dialogue. This is an unusual subject for a Medical Center Hour, and there are those among you who may say, as a matter of fact, there are those who are not here, who may say, what is this to do with medicine? Well, actually, it's got everything to do with medicine. Those things which bother people the most are the things that have to do with medicine. Consequently, I feel that it's an appropriate kind of a thing to take up. Now, today we have an unusual opportunity because Dr. Porterfield here on my immediate right and Dr. Spradlin have published a book which is entitled The Search for Certainty. Two copies of that. This is an extraordinary book, and it's painted on an amazing canvas. And for those of you who have not had the opportunity to read it, I'd suggest you go to the library and try and get it and read it. It is an amazing thing that starts at one end of the spectrum of humankind and goes to the present. It even goes to the future. The subject today is complex, and what we're going to do is to ask Professor Porterfield to start, and then Dr. Joseph Fletcher will follow her. And all of you know Joe and know his contributions to many Medical Center Hour, and I'm sure you're relieved to see that he is back, though his one wing has been clipped a bit. It is still there and still functioning, and he's raring to go. And then on his right is Will Spradlin, who is professor of psychiatry and chairman of that department in behavioral medicine. And then on my opposite side is my opposite member, Jim Childress, who is Kyle Professor of Christian Studies here at the university and co-director of the Medical Center Hour. What we plan to do today is to have it start with Professor Porterfield, who will talk to us about what the book had to say, and then continue from there wherever it may go. And I was struck in reading the book how a beginning of another book, which was one that is called Pilgriman by Russell Hoban, began. And it starts off saying, Pilgriman here. I call myself Pilgriman. It's a convenience. What my name was when I was walking around in the shape of a man, I don't know. I simply can't remember. What I am now is waves and particles. I don't need to walk around. I just go. But still I am. Still I am of the world. Still I have something to say. How could it be otherwise? Nothing comes to an end. The action never stops. It only changes. Now, with that as an introduction, Patty?
I'm so pleased to have this opportunity. I was very excited when Dr. Thorpe invited us to do this. I was excited until I asked him what I was supposed to do, and he said, condense your book into 10 or 15 minutes. I'm afraid that what you might get is what I got many, many years ago when my 4 children were small, and they came to me and said, Mama, we want to tell you a bedtime story instead of you telling us one. And I said, fine. So they got me in a chair and they said, are you ready? And I said, yes. So the one who was the spokesman said, once upon a time, and they lived happily ever after. I cannot, of course, condense a book into a few words. What Dr. Spradlin and I have done is to take some of the ideas which we presented in The Search for Certainty, which we think might be of interest to this audience, and share those with you. So let me begin. Are you ready? Once upon a time, a very long time ago, someone first asked the questions, what am I? How is it that I can think? What is thought? What is mind? What is the brain? What is the world really like? In essence, what is the human condition? We've been asking the same questions ever since. In our book, we've attempted to trace the history of various conceptual frames we have used to address these questions. One concept would lead us to believe that we are negentropic. We gather information. In a sense, we may say that the nervous system has specialized in coding, moving, and storing information, usually arising from processes of short duration. That is, light waves in sight, sound waves in hearing, pressure gradients in touch and position, and molecular arrangements in taste and smell. All these stimuli initiate patterns or waves of electrochemical activity in cells and nerve tissue. In these waves of activity, information is coded, moved, and organized or stored. How these experienced waves are processed is one of the most complex and fascinating problems we have ever addressed. Now, what most of us want to do when we study a system is to break it down into its smallest parts. We immediately encounter difficulty if we attempt to use a reductionistic approach to the study of the central nervous system. The processes of mind and brain are not reducible to the study of the individual atoms composing the specialized tissues involved. We cannot determine which atoms and cells are responsible for the information processing activity involved in any single decision of the brain. Sir Arthur Stanley Eddington explained, "But it is physically improbable that each atom has its duty in the brain so precisely allotted that the control of its behavior would prevail over all possible irregularities of the other atoms. If I have at all rightly understood the processes of my own mind, there is no finicking with the individual atoms. I do not think that our decisions are precisely balanced on the conduct of certain key atoms. Could we pick up one atom in Einstein's brain and say that if it had made the wrong quantum jump, there would have been a corresponding flaw in the theory of relativity? If we can't explain the information processing activities of the central nervous system in a strictly reductionistic manner, how can we explain it? One format that has proven useful is to use the terms analog and digital to describe the two ways by which the human central nervous system processes information. By analog, we are implying a gradient or proportional response to stimuli or data, and by digital, we are implying the unitization of data. Split brain research has indicated that each person possesses two different and separate modes of data processing that operate simultaneously. The left hemisphere is the domain of analytical, verbal, and logical thinking. It specializes in logic, mathematics, speech, and abstract conceptualizations. The right hemisphere is the domain of the pictorial or visuospatial mode of processing information, in which perceived relationships occur simultaneously in a continuous or analog format. Although it is generally acknowledged that each person possesses and utilizes both the analog and digital modes of information processing, Western thinking is largely biased toward the digital as the most desirable. Comparisons are often made between concrete and abstract thinking, or between rational and emotional thinking, with the implication being that the discursive or digital is the more acceptable. Joseph Bogan, who's been involved in split brain research with Roger Sperry at the California Institute of Technology, says, more likely this evaluation is not cultural in origin, but arises from the fact that the hemisphere which does the propositioning is also the one having a near monopoly on the capacity for naming. Now, individuals differ enormously in the way in which they view the world. Each person processes information according to the bias of his or her mental constructions. Our sense organs are involved in the gathering of information, which our brains then sort, code, store, and modify. The organization of the information processing system may be seen as a filtering or transferring process so the stimuli are patterned in a prearranged format. The filtering process is evident throughout the information processing operation, and it filters out all but a small amount of the information in our external environment. Aldous Huxley has suggested that while each one of us is potentially mind at large, our individual brains must, in order to allow us to survive, reduce sensory input to that measly trickle of the kinds of consciousness which will help us to stay alive on the surface of this particular planet. Electromagnetic waves have to be within a certain frequency to chemically alter the retina and evoke a potential in the brain. Sound wave frequencies have to be within a certain range and of sufficient magnitude to register in the brain. The brain has to be at a certain state of arousal for the information to come to our attention. We have become accustomed to conceptualizing our world as having only those properties that are acceptable to the filters of our information processing system. We are restricted by our evolution to experiencing the world only in ways permitted by our sensory organs. Research psychologist Robert E. Ornstein explains, If we do not possess a sense for a given energy form, we do not experience its existence. It is almost impossible for us to imagine an energy form or an object outside our normal receptive range. What would infrared radiation or an X-ray look like? What is the sound of a one-cycle note? Or, as in Zen, what would be the sound of one hand clapping? We human beings have evolved to appreciate only certain aspects of the physical world related to seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and touching. We are, because of these limitations, inclined to believe that what we are experiencing is the whole of the known universe, that our mode of information processing is the true reality. We take this position even further and assume that what we term I or me is the only entity seeing the true picture of reality. Ornstein related the following story. A father said to his double-seeing son, "Son, you see two instead of one." "How can that be?" the boy replied. "If I were, there would seem to be 4 moons up there instead of 2. What we call ordinary consciousness is thought to be the personal or private construction of each individual. Alfred North Whitehead, eminent mathematician and philosopher, said, "Thus nature gets credit which should in truth be reserved for ourselves, the rose for its scent, the nightingale for his song, and the sun for its radiance. The poets are entirely mistaken. They should address their lyrics to themselves and should turn them into odes of self-congratulation on the excellency of the human mind. Nature is a dull affair, soundless, scentless, colorless, merely the hurrying of material, endlessly, meaninglessly." In some strange way, we have done exactly what Whitehead proposed, but we have not always been aware of it. For if we consider the basic tenets of quantum mechanics in the world of the new physics, we are describing a subjective environment while labeling our observations with objective terms. In atomic physics, for example, the investigator is describing his interactions with the object he is studying and not any properties inherent in the object itself. As Werner Heisenberg explained, what we observe is not nature itself, but nature exposed to our method of questioning. In our methods of questioning, we have continued to differentiate. The realization of our own individuality and our own selfhood implies the use of differentiating instruments, including the use of language symbols that have common meaning. Now, one of the paradoxes that occurs when we divide our world into units resides in the question, is the world a continuous process, or is it a sequence of discrete units? An analogous question, and one being addressed by physicists, is light a wave or a particle? Sir James Jeans wrote, "It seems at least conceivable that what is true of perceived objects may also be true of perceived minds. Just as there are wave pictures for light and electricity, so there may be a corresponding picture for consciousness. When we view ourselves in space and time, our consciousnesses are obviously the separate individuals of a particle picture. But when we pass beyond space and time, they may perhaps form ingredients of a single continuous stream of life. As it is with light and electricity, so it may be with life. The phenomena may be individuals carrying on separate existences in space and time, while in the deeper reality beyond space and time, we may all be members of one body." Our answer to the question, is the world a continuous process or is it a sequence of discrete units, is it is both. Our choice between these modes of information processing is relative to the situation. We can say that self is a continuous fluid process and that self is a discrete, unitized phenomenon. The choice depends on the information processing paradigm we are using. If we are forced to choose one as the truth and exclude the other, we have a distortion. Now, how are we going to bring some order into our thinking? Perhaps we may start with the pragmatic assumption that the study of ourselves, the human condition, and our world is the study of the movement, coding, and storage of information in systems. We may arbitrarily divide information processing into 2 main formats, the continuous or analog and the interrupted or digital. We may appreciate ourselves and our world as modes of organized information. If we use an interrupted or digital mode, we have the world of things and events. If we use the continuous mode, we have a flowing process without definite boundaries. What is correct? Is it a wave or a particle? It is both. The differentiation is in our process of organizing information. Using the continuous format, all information has a wave-like quality without definitive boundaries. Using the interrupted format, information has a particle-like quality with circumscribed boundaries. Since our central nervous system seems to use both formats simultaneously, we may appreciate the difficulty that occurs when we focus on one format to the exclusion of the other. Yet this is what we attempt to do for most of us, and I think especially us, are uncomfortable with the concept of both and want an either-or paradigm. In studying the digital and analogic modes of organizing information from a historical perspective, we are impressed that they are so distinct in Eastern and Western cultures. Certain Eastern cultures have emphasized the continuous or analog format in a philosophic orientation that views us and our world as a flowing process. In Western culture, heavy emphasis has been placed on the digital or interrupted, with the eventual evolution of word and number systems and instruments for differentiating, which we call technology. The Western world, with its increasing interest in scientific proof, as opposed to mystical intuition, turned in the direction of the digital mode that then permeated every aspect of Western life and thinking. Although the new discoveries of physics have awakened an interest in Eastern philosophy, and although their similarities are striking, the difficulties in combining these two disparate ways of thinking, the Eastern analogic and the Western digital, are not to be underestimated. The Western world seems to be faced with the paradoxical situation of having to attune itself to an analogic digital combination that, although apparently manifest in brain physiology, is almost unthinkable in Western terms. The participatory universe, in which human consciousness is an integral part of the cosmic whole, is as much a framework for modern physics as it is for ancient Eastern philosophy. As physicists experience their inability to reduce the universe to a fundamental particle, they encounter Eastern mysticism, which has long held that there is no fundamental particle and that everything is linked to everything else. What does all this have to do with us? The particle and wave pictures of the universe are not confined to mystics and physicists. The duality of our perceptions and our thinking is evident in all aspects of our lives. Perhaps science and mysticism are merely two complementary manifestations of the human mind, of its rational and intuitive faculties. When we carry the two modes of processing information to the extreme, we begin to appreciate the distortion. When mathematics and measuring are pushed beyond their limits, we begin to appreciate the continuous or relative nature of process. When all differentiation is abdicated, we resemble other primates with no technology and deteriorating culture. The interaction of these two modes and the hybridization of Eastern and Western philosophic thought we are now witnessing in the 20th century, concomitant with the most recent discoveries in mathematics and physics, may produce some profound changes in our thinking, especially in our theories concerning ourselves and the human condition. At present, it would seem that we will never be certain. This should not, however, make the search for certainty less exciting. Sir Charles Sherrington said, "The world runs for all to read. We go about, and many of us are glad at times. Natural knowledge we commonly account a joyous thing, but it is clearly a saddening thing as well. Nature is like a music to which two friends can listen and both be moved, and yet each by a different train of thought. And the pursuit whose quest is nature's understanding has this among its rewards, that is, as it progresses, its truth is testable. Truth is a value. The quest itself, therefore, is in a measure its own satisfaction. We receive the lesson that our advanced knowledge is of asymptotic type, even as continually approaching, so continually without arrival. The satisfaction shall therefore be eternal."
That's tremendous. That is a classic example of reductionism. 250-page book, and you have just, you've heard a nice synopsis of that in 15 minutes. Patty, that was beautiful. Now I'm going to ask Dr. Fletcher if he will make comments like that.
I'm going to try to be equally analogic and digitalic. In a very elegant and scientific way, Dr. Porterfield has just told us how relative and uncertain our information gathering and processing and our knowledge and our understanding are. And this takes me back to my student days when I learned how Copernicus had ruined any idea that the earth is the center of things, and Darwin destroyed the notion that man is different from the other animals, and Freud showed that what we think is not the case, and often in the deepest levels of our minds. And now along come physicists like Einstein and Heisenberg, who tell us that the physical world we live in is itself all a matter of relativity, just as we are and our thinking is. And even the mathematicians we thought had the exact tool for measuring things now admit that the principle of uncertainty makes even their calculations ultimately only relative. And this is what Gödel and Russell and others have done to what we used to think of as the exact science. Alas, they say it's not exact at all. Matter itself, material things, aren't material at all. They're immaterial, force fields of energy, dynamic interactions, electrons bouncing around neutrons and protons and not bouncing altogether predictably at all. So, the physical world is uncertain or indeterminate. We human beings who live in the world are likewise indeterminate. Our minds and methods of knowing anything are indeterminate. And the psychologists tell us that this is so, and medical specialists in endocrinology tell us the same thing, though for different reasons. All right. Let's let the matter sit right there for a minute. The world is uncertain right down to its rock bottom. And so are we human beings who knock around in it. Now I want to say something about the book, The Search for Certainty. When I read it, I was overwhelmed. These two people bring us, it seems to me, a rare and rich and fascinating store of data to bear from all the sciences, physics and chemistry and brain physiology and psychology, as well as history and philosophy and poetry. And I'll tell you what I think about their book. I think it is the most significant contribution to the history of ideas, intellectual history, if you like, that we've seen in the last quarter of a century. But I don't say this to butter them up. They don't want their teacher's apple polished, and it doesn't need it. My reason for saying this is quite different. For even though I am utterly convinced that ours is a universe of uncertainty, that man's attempt to find certainty, first religiously, by faith, and then scientifically by so-called hard data, is a failure. But I want to go on then to say, quite seriously, that their conclusion really doesn't make any practical difference to us human beings at all. That our human condition is still just as strong and just as potent and just as rich with promise as it ever was. I want you to notice that I say no practical difference. If you want a label for it, I'm speaking as a pragmatist, one who believes that an idea is true if it works operationally. And that's a philosophical position with a long history. So let me relate it to the search for certainty. Or perhaps I should say the failure of the search for certainty. A German philosopher named Hans Wegener, contemporary he was with William James here in America, contended, as James did, that an idea or theory could be unverified or apparently unverified and apparently false, and yet it could work. It could be relied upon in practice to produce its logical and appropriate results. Let me give you an example. We've learned from Max Planck and Einstein's general theory of relativity, and Gödel and Schrödinger and others, that Pythagoras and Euclid and Kepler and Galileo and Descartes and Isaac Newton were all wrong about the geometrical certainty of time and space and mass. But look, nevertheless, in spite of their testimony, the moon is out there 238,855 miles away from the Earth, and our space experts have figured that at a variation of from 45 to 135 degrees, with a coefficient of 0.066, and on the basis of a sidereal month of 27.32 days, complete revolution in relation to the stars, if we figured it as if what we think we know is reliable for calculation purposes, we could hit the moon dead on target. And that's exactly, of course, what NASA did. And they do these mind-boggling feats by what Wegener called Ausabe, as if the physics and chemistry and math and astronomy are truly exact. As if the idea of certainty in our knowledge was in fact valid. And this is why I say that the principle of indeterminism and uncertainty may well be correct descriptively, but nevertheless it makes no practical difference. We can and should, I should think, go on, right on acting as if there is certainty in distance and weight and density and clock time and our other scientific assumptions about measurability and reliability. If we can push the right button, the elevator goes up, not down. The indicated medicine or surgery will help the patient. Or we might answer Dr. Porterfield's very delicate and intriguing Zen image by saying, I hope not too bluntly, that there is no sound when only one hand is clapping. Old Cardinal Newman tried to sell Christianity the cheap way in a book of his called The Grammar of Assent. But at least he did offer us an important distinction. He distinguished between certainty, which he agreed was impossible for us finite human beings, on the one hand, and on the other hand, certitude. That is, a confident trust in what we think or believe. And our human condition, even with all the uncertainty behind what we think and do, is still competent and constructive with all the creative dynamics of curiosity and loving concern. We grow and we learn, We struggle and we laugh and we cry with our faces turned to the sun. What I'm trying to say is that we have, in my judgment, abundant proof that although we are without certainty, the certitudes of the human mind and spirit pay off in the consequences. They validate themselves. They stand up, if you like, under the pragmatic test. It is just possible, you know, that the principle of uncertainty or indeterminacy is, after all, only still a solution, still looking for a problem. I hope I've been sufficiently contentious, Mr. Chairman.
You've done beautifully as always. Dr. Spradlin, I think we put this in the correct order. Now you can go and bring about the synthesis.
Are they going to be able to hear me if I sit here? Can you all hear me?